Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us once again for a CIO East Africa webinar. Today, our focus is on business continuity planning. I do believe a lot of you have had a bit of problems around this because this is something that not many organizations are prepared for. And now you're finding yourselves in a situation where you have to get things going on the fly. So we felt it was right for us to hold a webinar around business continuity planning, aka aBCP, to give you a few tips and tricks on how to get going in this. We do have two experts with us today. We have Mushemi Wambugu, who's the founder of Serious Consultancy, which is a technology transformation organization. Very exciting to have him here. And then we also have William Makatiani, who's the CEO at an IT security company, Serianu. We all know that security is also a big deal now that everybody is working remotely. So I'm not going to take too much of your time because I'm not the one with the contents. I'm also here to learn like you are here to learn. I will hand over immediately to Mushemi to walk us through some of the things that we should look out for when putting together your BCP plan. Now, as we go through the webinar, as usual, post your questions in the Q&A window. We shall answer the questions at the end of the session. Secondly, we are running polls, so please feel free to go and answer the polls as we go through this session for the next 1 hour. Thank you. Mushemi, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. Hope you can all hear me well. I'm going to chat briefly about business continuity planning. Many of you or some of you have heard about it, or some of you have even worked within a framework of business continuity planning. It's important now because of the environment that we find ourselves in, particularly based on the pandemic that is ongoing, but more so preparing your organizations for the future and finding out how to be prepared to work through some of the things that are available. So it's really very simple, the presentation that I have for you today. What I'll want to do first is to cover the basic concept, what is a BCP? Then I'll go through development considerations, how do you develop one? Some of the dependencies that the BCP has. What are the best practices that we follow when designing a BCP? How to execute a BCP when it's time, and then some concluding thoughts that I have thought through. The presentation is fairly small, so but I'll spend most of my time just discussing the concepts that are here, and then we can ask any questions that you might have. So in my slides, I'll start by basically just reading Will Kenton's definition of a BCP, just so that I can give context to what really a BCP is. And he says that business continuity planning is the process involved in creating a system of prevention and recovery from potential threats to a company. Really, we are trying to figure out what is it that can go wrong within an organization. And when people are thinking technology, they are thinking disaster recovery, and that is not it. This is about people. This is about how people interact with assets within the organization. And this is also regarding the organization as an asset and an individual at the same time. He goes on to say that the plan ensures that personnel and assets are protected and are able to function quickly in the event of a disaster. Now, a pandemic like the one that we are in can be considered a disaster because really, even though equipment was not damaged, but the movement of people, the working of people, the engagement in commerce has actually stopped. The BCP is also generally conceived in advance and involves input from key stakeholders and personnel. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about this part because many of you, I hope you have a BCP. And if you don't, then this could be a tricky time to be setting one up. But you're still not too late. And I think there's a possibility that we can manage to move it forward. So having defined what a BCP is, the next item there is what are the BCP development considerations? So in this case, I decided to take this in the form of questions. asking or challenging questions, because I know many of you who have probably logged in already have worked through one before. So this is not really to train you how to do it. It's really to ask you whether you considered some of these things. So one of the questions I had is, does the organization have a mission critical versus non-mission critical applications list? Now, many organizations say that, oh, my mission critical application is email. In some cases, yes, but in most cases, no. If you go to a bank, maybe core banking application is your mission critical application. So one of the things that you really need to think about is, what are those applications that are going to be used that if they don't get used will stop the organization from functioning? Secondly, who are those people that you consider mission critical in the delivery of the services or the delivery of the things that you have for your organization? Those things are also very critical. So if you have those two lists, you're well on your way into developing a good BCP. Second question is, does your organization have a risk framework and methodology? Now, many people have talked loosely about enterprise risk management, but many people have not implemented what we call a risk framework and a risk methodology. In this case, some of the questions is, do you have a CRO in your organization, a chief risk officer? In your organization, do you work through the mitigation planning and the risk assessments for your organization so that you can see where critical risks will come in from an organization perspective? And if people cannot move, what do we need to do? Is that documented? Third is, who are the people responsible for the BCP and who are the people responsible for the execution of the BCP? So there are those we call the custodians of the BCP. In many organizations I have seen, falls under the risk officer, who assesses these risks and puts them into this plan. But also there are those who are responsible for the execution should something happen. So who's going to execute on that plan? So there are some people, like I'm fortunate to sit on some boards where they have red, blue, and green teams who are there now to start executing the plan as they have put it in the business continuity plan. The next is, does the organization communication strategy exist? Now, remember that your organization is a living, breathing institution. So therefore, one of the key things that a BCP will try and do is, in managing people, is also to protect the brand. If you're going to protect the brand, how are you going to communicate? Many of you have listened to Mutahi Kagwe talk about how the pandemic is advancing. They have set up a communication plan that allows the individual citizens to understand what this pandemic is, what it is capable of doing, and how the government has tackled the situation. So in your organization, how many people have been quarantined? How many people are coming to work? How many people are working from home? You know, all those, and how are you communicating with them? Do you have what we call a call tree, so that if you call a person and is not available, the next person in line will be called? And if you have a call tree, how do you communicate with your third-party stakeholders in order to deliver on the services that your organization have? The next thing you should also consider is, does an emergency contact list exist? Which means that, do you have contacts to your insurance organization, to your hospitals, to the people who can be called if I'm a part of the organization and I'm sick? So what then happens? Who do I call in order to be assisted in order to get out of this? And if it is there, do you have it up to date? There are some people who have in their lists work numbers, others have private numbers. Now, do I know that the number that I have there is actually a current number? Is it a private number? Is it a work number? And can I actually test it? I do some work with development organizations, and they've been sending me messages on SMS asking me, am I okay? Do I need any help? And I just respond, just like the polls that we have on this webinar. That is very, very critical to have for an organization to continue beating. The last thing I put there was, how will they be reached? How are people reached if you need to reach them? And I think I've discussed that as an item in the previous point. The next thing is, some organizations either have one place in which they work. Now, before the pandemic, it didn't matter whether you had like 20 people within a room and sitting open plan. Now, there's an issue. If your CEO is sitting in that same open space, there's a problem. You can ask him or her to go work from home. But then there are some critical people who can work offsite. Now, there are organizations who set up what we call work area recovery sites, and then they put connectivity to those sites within what we call a virtual private network environment, so that people can work from not within that organization, but offsite and still achieve the objectives as if they were on site. These are very important sites, and some people have them, but the ones who don't have them, you have to now think through who needs to get access to the organization and how, by virtue of secure organizations, and I think William will discuss that. The other thing is, where does your data reside? There are some whose data resides on-site, and in some cases you cannot get into your office or you cannot get into your data center. Do you have that information backed up? Do you have that information on the cloud? If it is so, do you have enough bandwidth that you can connect people to? So these are things that people should think about when executing a BCP. And in that same vein, how will this data be accessed? Now, one of the things that we are seeing, and I'm talking to a lot of clients, is the security angle, which William will talk about giving the rights to access the data, access to the information, and who has the authority to actually execute in some of these data pieces. The last point there is, who are your third-party business suppliers? Now, a lot of people have overlooked this area. Now, when I talk about third-party business suppliers, I'm talking about people who supply you with bandwidth, people who supply you with your necessities. What does your organization need to function that is not produced or curated within the organization? Those things need to be set up so that you have clear line of sight as to how to engage those people should there be a problem. And so these aspects are put into your business continuity plan, so that way you're able to move forward within a concept of a pandemic like the one that we have. So after we'd taken those considerations, I wanted to really query and ask, what are some of the BCP dependencies? So in order to come up with a good BCP, a BCP comes from the business strategy. And this is consult speak, but it is important. One of the key things is, where's the business going? What are the business metrics? Because one of the things that a BCP has is the metrics that actually govern the organization. So say, for instance, if it's a bank, how do your creditors look like? How do your debtors look like? How is your Forex situation? So those metrics are being measured at the same time coming from your business strategy. The next is your enterprise risk framework. It is important because if you have a good framework, then that part of the organization can track any threats, any risks, any activities that actually can damage the organization. The next is a technology strategy. Now, many people will look at a business strategy, but once you've set up that strategy, then you need to execute it technologically using a technology strategy, because that technology strategy will tell you your third-party connectivity, your work area recovery connectivity. It'll talk about where the systems are. It'll talk about how people engage with data, etc. How do you secure data, etc. Then, because business continuity planning relies a lot on people, you also need to think about how you secure your assets. And that has its own plan called the disaster recovery plan. So if in case there's a disaster, how are you going to recoup your data? How are you going to bring back your systems so that business can continue with or without the primary systems that you had? The last is something I had spoken about earlier, your third-party relationships. Those you have to keep a very close eye on, because sometimes if you look at the fine text in the contracts, they may not be, during a pandemic or during a disaster, work in your favor. So you may need to spend money in order to get those services from those people whom you have relied on greatly. Secondly is, the people that you have relied on, can they also get the services that they require in order to help you? So now many of us have relied on China to get a lot of information and to get a lot of assets and deliveries. If they rely on their equipment from such places and they cannot get to it, or like now there's a lockdown in flights, you have a problem. And so you need to think through in your business continuity plan how you're going to deal with those contracts in order so that you're prepared should there be a pandemic. The next is, I wanted to talk about some best practices and what should happen before BCP is executed. Like we said earlier, it should come before in its definition. So some of the things that I have seen that work, you probably need to have a current BCP and a disaster recovery plan. Those documents need to be up to date. If many people, when I was doing active consulting, which I still do, but when I was working, I used to see people, they would hire us to do a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan. Then they put it there and it gathers dust because nobody ever thinks that they're going to use it. Now it's time to use it. The problem is that if you've never looked at it, the CEO may have changed, the CFO may have changed, a lot of people may have changed within that framework. Assets and equipment will have changed. So you need to be looking at it at least every quarter to make sure that it is up to date. The second thing is you need to test. Now, within the risk framework, you need to go and identify what you'd call as business risks, and you also need to identify what you call people risks and process risks. That way, then you're able to set up mitigation plans should the organization be in trouble based on environmental change such as the one we have today. Then you need to also test work area recovery sites. In this case, if you have you have bought some space for work area recovery, or you have places where your CEO or your CFO or your key personnel are going to be, you need to test the connectivity to make sure if A, you have enough bandwidth, B, that the telephones are working, C, that the data that is going to be transacted is secure, and D, that it is always on. The next thing is also test the call tree. We talked about mission critical staff and how we connect with them. And so those things are important because if you cannot test for whether you can reach them, the day that you actually need to reach them, you may not be able to. And so there's going to be panic. The next is also testing communications, internal and external. Do you have some scripts that you have set up that can actually be used to communicate to your users? And those test scripts, have they been reviewed for empathy? Because many people sometimes are blind. They are probably sometimes tone deaf. In that case, you can really irritate a lot of the people who work for you internally for your organization, or to look like you're not only not sensible, but not non-empathetic to the people outside who are your customers. So you probably need to look at the best way in which you look at how you communicate with people. Another area is also looking at to test the DRP activation. So now when I talk about the DRP activation, if you go to a disaster recovery mode, so because a system doesn't care whether you have a pandemic or not, a hard drive will fail. And have you gotten that data? Now, if you switch over to a disaster recovery framework, can the people who are in the work area recovery site or the people working offsite be able to access that same data seamlessly? If you haven't tested that, that could be a very big gap for you, and you can really suffer in the short to medium term. The other thing is also to review the contracts and the relationships that you have with your third parties. Some people will set up, let's say, insurance type of policies so that you make sure that they are holding some equipment for you, or that the contract requires that they can do some additional activities for free, even in times like this. And in some organizations, they are going to be asking, okay, are you a person who's an essential services person? And how do you get around if this equipment fails during, let's say, during a curfew period, and maybe some of your clients are in the US, so that when we are asleep here, they are awake there. You need to think through some of these third-party relationships. Then you also need to review process, document, create lessons learned from this procedure, so that then you can update the BCP. Remember, everything that you're doing is a test run, so that when it's time to activate it, it is seamless and then there's no crisis. So having looked at what is a BCP, developing and some considerations, some dependencies, we've also looked at some best practices. So what do you need to do to execute? The first thing, and I have seen in some places where I have worked with some clients, they have really done this really well. They've looked at their risk register. So now the guys who are going to be now taking over the BCP, the chief risk officer comes and outlines everything that is a threat to the organization. So they look at what the business needs to run, what the environment looks like, what the internal capabilities and competencies look like, and then they look at how to respond. So the risk register is reviewed. The issue within the pandemic environment like we are in is communicated, and it's communicated to the clients and also to the people who are working internally in the organization. The next thing is that you need to look at the teams who are going to activate the BCP. Who's going to work offsite? Where are they going to work? What connectivity do they have? Who are the teams that are going to be working on the ground? How many hours should they work? Are they going to be on a rotation basis? So you start setting up that. The next thing is you now engage your call tree so that you say these decisions, particularly that are critical to the organizations, need to be made in such and such a time, in such and such an order. So is this person ready to make the call? And then you also need to find out within your organizational structure where everybody is and whether everybody is well, particularly within the environment that we're in. The other is also setting up a work area recovery. In those places where you are working so many people that were densely populated, some people can work from home. As we said, some people can go on leave. And then there are some people who are working offsite in a secure area so that they can be able to transact business. One thing that some of your organizations are probably not doing that is very good for governance is to include your board. How are you updating your non-executive and your executive directors? Remember, they are your stakeholders who actually stand on behalf of the organization. Proper communication with them is very critical in order to make sure that the decisions that you are making for brand protection, for availability, and for response are clearly articulated. The next, and I've been talking about this for a while, is thinking about your third-party stakeholders. Now you need to engage them actively because remember, you're not the only one that they service. So how is it that you can make sure that you give them a clear plan that within their space, they are able to consider you as one of those people who they should critically be thinking about? The other thing that is a bit foreign to the organizations that we have, particularly because of our own culture, is succession activation. So if your CEO gets the coronavirus, for instance, who will be making decisions on his or her behalf? If your CFO is incapacitated, either because of the pandemic or because of other reasons, who then makes decisions on his or her behalf? You need to have that so that those people who are going to be filling in their shoes have access to those areas, but also can be able to communicate with them and discuss the possibilities so that somebody doesn't have to be brought up to speed in order to be able to make critical decisions. We saw that with the Prime Minister of England. And so if that can happen at such a level, your organization is also prone to being affected that way. So if you look at that, then if you execute per this tree, you'll be able to be very successful. So after looking at all of those things, I wanted to touch base on some concluding thoughts. In order for a BCP to work, it's not a technology document. In fact, if anything, it is a business document. And it is a business document that should be held and owned at the highest level. In most cases that I have seen, and I've been involved in some critical decision-making areas, the CEO takes ownership for this. And the CRO takes execution ownership. So ownership at the top, at the board level, the CEO level, and the chief risk officer level will allow everybody to be aligned to make sure that this thing works. Second is also, once you've looked at your BCP, you'll be able to identify what resource is missing. Some people might have so many vacation days and they have to go. Some people may be prone to being sick. Maybe they are 55 plus or 60 plus with some pre-existing conditions. Do you have resources that will be able to fill in for them? Third is, do you understand your brand? Many people may not understand what are the metrics of the organizations. Like can you be able to differentiate those who've come for a paycheck and those who don't? Do people understand what this business represents? And do they understand what the brand represents? So one is about actually making money, and the other one is about becoming a corporate citizen in your environment to make sure that you have brand leadership. I have seen some organizations who have pledged some amount of money to help the poor and vulnerable. This is a place where now an organization can use its brand to be able to be a standout corporate citizen. The next is communicate, communicate, communicate. If you keep quiet with how you're executing your business continuity plan, many people start filling in the gaps for you. They start making assumptions, particularly if you're a critical organization within the sphere that which we live. So if you don't communicate and tell people what is happening, imagine if you're a bank and you're not communicating to your customers about how you're reacting to this, or to your internal employees how you're going to moderate this. This could cause a big problem within the organization. So the more you communicate properly and accurately with facts, the better it is that we can go through this pandemic. The last but not least, because we have a good plan in a business continuity plan, we have a disaster recovery plan, and we have a strategy for which we are following. If those documents are current and up to date, we'll be able to actually make sure that we can execute all those things that we have said we have calmly, so that we can get over this. I hope those nuggets help, and I'll be happy to take any questions once the moderator decides. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mushemi. Fantastic guidance over there. I must say, for me, I learned quite a bit. I love the communicate part. In fact, I think it's the one thing that everybody forgets. We under-communicate and try to manage the situation. And when things fall apart is when it's normally after the fact. I like the fact that you talked about continuously reviewing the plan, which is fantastic. Don't just have a static plan. Situations change. And the testing, I think that's very, very important. The pertinent questions that organizations should ask when they are putting together their plan or thinking about their plan, I think is also very, very important for those who are starting. So we have a few questions in the Q&A window, but we're going to answer them after the fact. Right now, I'm going to leave the floor to William. William, take it over. Talk to us about BCP and disaster recovery. I'm sure you're going to touch on some kind of security as well, which is very important right now. We're hearing all sorts of things and seeing all sorts of things in the media. William, take it over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much again, Mushemi, for just leading this. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, in terms of just the way forward today, we'll talk a bit about some of the major events and disruptions that we are noticing. We'll talk about business continuity overview, a shift in focus for businesses, role of management, and within those topics, I'll be talking a bit about security. I'll be talking about some of the challenges and some of the questions that I've noted from the Q&A section. Again, for those who don't know me, again, I do run a consulting company called Seriano Limited. We are based here in Kenya, and we consult across Africa. And a part of that process is helping organizations monitor their availability, monitor their security, and monitor around fraud and some of the challenges, IT risk challenges that these organizations face. So let's start with the typical sense. When some of us, or rather when most organizations think about disruption, they are thinking about flooding, they're thinking about wars, but we need to come home and start asking ourselves. Think about the Westgate Mall attack in 2013. If you had an office or a branch in the Westgate Mall, how would you have reacted? Think about the Garissa attack. Think about the Japan earthquake and the tsunami disaster. Think about the 2007-2008 post-election violence. Think about the Kenya Airways Douala air crash of 2007. And very, very recently, Dusit terrorist attack. There were quite a number of organizations that were based at the Dusit complex. And it becomes very critical for us to start asking ourselves, what if? The other part now is even COVID. When you think about it, we've gotten to a point where we need to be ready. We need to prepare ourselves. So when some of these things happen, you can easily be able to recover. Now, when you talk about business continuity, there are quite a number of terms, and I'll be introducing different terms as we continue. I will try as much as possible not to repeat what Mushemi has talked about. But when you think about this, there's an aspect of people. At the end of the day, you need people to work. Think about Kenya Revenue Authority today. If KRA closes, of course, nobody will be able to work. Without the infrastructure for people to come in and be able to access those systems and allow you to ask questions, it becomes critical. Then the second point is on facilities. Is there an office? Is there a plant? Is it on equipment? Is it manufacturing? And then you have computer systems, and then you have telecommunication. So the reliability and the continuity of operations are key to business survival and competitive advantage. Now, when you think about business continuity, and when you think about business continuity, it's a bigger scope. we do have crisis management, we do have disaster recovery, and I'll talk about all the different aspects. You need to think about unplanned events. You need to think about security threats. For example, if you get hacked today and you're hit by ransomware, of course, it becomes an emergency. So as we think about BCP, we shouldn't just think about the pandemic and COVID alone. We should think about organizations that have been hit by ransomware. And there have been cases where an organization has been hit by ransomware and they've been down for almost 3 days. How will you respond? What is the cost of downtime? Infrastructure duplication dependencies. Right now, we have organizations that depend on so many other integrators to a point when all the integrators goes down, it becomes a problem. And now we also have the issue of regulatory requirements, which is also a critical part that we need to worry about. Now, one of the key things around definitions that we need to look at and understand is understanding what BCP, and I think based on what Mushemi said, I'll just repeat this a little bit, the ability and readiness to manage business interruptions in order to provide continuity of services at a minimum acceptable level. And this is a definition by Business Continuity Institute. And by the way, if you have time, pass by their website. They've just done a survey of how organizations are responding to this whole thing, the pandemic. It might be a good idea for you to pass by there and just see some of the things they've done. In terms of overview, again, when you think about a BCM, it seeks to identify potential impacts that threaten an organization. It provides a framework for building resilience and provides capability for an effective response. Consists of two main aspects. There's the business continuity plan, which focuses on recovery of business processes, and then disaster recovery plan, which focuses on recovery of IT systems. Two different things, BCP and DRP. DRP will focus on technology, but remember at the end of the day, the disaster recovery plan, which is a technology component, supports the business. In a typical flow, everything works normally. And at that time, we assume you're building resilience, you're building redundancy. As time goes by, there is a disruption. The question then becomes, can you be able to come back to normal operations? And the goal of a BCP, the goal of a DRP, the goal of a contingency plan is to look at all those different aspects and ask yourself, if today when we are operating, we have 400 people, what is the minimum number that we need for us to be able to provide the critical services? To be able to do that, you need to ask yourselves, what are those critical services? So normalcy after an incident doesn't mean 100%. It means the ability to continue serving the critical services or critical customers as you recover. Now, when you talk about BCP, again, I talked about the definitions, and it's very clear. BCM is owned at the business level. In fact, in most organizations, BCM are owned by the board. The BCPs will be owned at the operational CEO level. DR will be owned by operations in partnership with IT. But again, there is a very clear sense of who owns what, where, and how. What are some of the key elements to an effective BCP? Number one, effective communication by all required stakeholders. If today you are unwell and you're one of the cleaners, let's say you're a cleaner in one of these organizations, if the building goes down, the communication should be able to get to you. Same thing even at the CEO level. And that helps the organization to understand that it is very clear that we have a plan, and it doesn't matter what position you're in, but you're able to understand what to do if something does happen. Quality and up-to-date information in the BCP documentation. I've been involved in a drill, and in this particular drill, when they came up with the list of the contacts, the key personnel who were responsible for the BCP response plan, most of them had left the organization. So when you start thinking about the quality and up-to-date information, unless you have champions who own the documents and consistently update them, then you run into a situation where you might start calling people who've left or even moved to the other organizations. And of course, regular drills, tests, exercising of plans, and continuously validating all the assumptions that you made when you came up with. Let me talk about a few plans that, again, we talk about when you think about business continuity management. The first one is emergency response plan. And I'll just read what is there. It provides for the measures that need to be undertaken in the initial stages of an emergency incident to ensure that the incident is put out before it escalates to levels which threaten the corporation ability to provide service to its customers and stakeholders. Emergency response plan, in most cases, is owned at the CEO level and even at the board level. How do you declare an emergency? And you've seen cases where sometimes when we've had an issue, even at maybe a plane has gone down, you'll get the CEO coming on board media and talking about things. That is dependent on somebody going out and saying, this is how we'll approach a situation where we have an emergency and we need to declare an emergency. Crisis provides for an organized communication, protocols, procedures, and ways of dealing with a crisis, i.e., emergency incident that has not been contained with emergency response procedures and is threatening the organization's business activities. The events usually require the attention of management and subsequent activation of BCPs. It is a crisis, a big difference between a crisis and emergency. And then you have a BCP, what we've just discussed. And in terms of ownership, if you look at the statements I've given you there, emergency most of the time is owned by the board and the executive. Crisis management, C-level. Business continuity, C-level and operations. Disaster recovery, its operations and ICT. Now, let's talk about some of the trends that we are seeing that are impacting how we are developing business continuities and what we need to be worried about. Unlike many years ago, where you had everything internally and all you had with ISP, nowadays, most organizations now have managed services, which means a business continuity plan you develop has to consider your service providers. If you do have somebody who manages your mobile transactions and you're running a bank, you cannot just close yourself and assume if you recover, they will also be recovering. You have to question that. The other component is regulations and legislations. We are now seeing cases in Tanzania and Rwanda where they're talking about ensuring that the disaster recovery plan is locally based. And that is a major issue because we are seeing jurisdictions being very specific that if your DR is not in country, then we're not going to give you a license, which becomes critical. Same thing with even issues of cloud. We are now seeing the bigger cloud providers are now coming in country to make sure that the DR is local. The other part is insurance. What happens if you lose data? What happens if your entire plan doesn't work and you lose service and you have SLS? You have to be able to consider that. And you have things like contract and force majeure, similar to what just happened. How do you address those things? And those are legal aspects that need to be addressed. You have issues around bring your own device. If you're not able to access those devices or these devices are not able to come to your network, how will you manage that? Teleworking, which we are now all doing. Even this remote session right now, it's teleworking or remote access or rather remote session. And it's an aspect that we now need to consider. Now, the other problem that we now need to be careful about is the social media. Information flows so fast to a point where if there's a disaster in an area, people will know even before your own CEO knows, which means we now need to be able to appreciate if it's social media monitoring, how do you monitor that? From a technology perspective, what are some of the considerations? Your third parties and your outsourced service providers need to have the same capacity as you. If at all you're in the consumer business or retail business or some of these fast moving businesses. We have an issue around data protection and cybersecurity. Nowadays, if you're going to bring up infrastructure, it's very critical that you consider the issue of cybersecurity. I'll give you a very good example. In early March, there were probably around 500 RDP accessible servers on the internet from Kenya. As at last night I checked, we are at 1,500 accessible servers that have open remote desktop sessions. What this shows is most of these organizations had not planned on opening up their network and they don't have VPN connections, and therefore they've decided they will risk and open up the environments to everyone. Unfortunately, this then opens up the networks for hackers and even criminals who are able to go in. The other part is again around cloud computing and shared services. We now have capability. I was just talking to somebody this morning and I was telling them we need to be very grateful for the innovations that have gone into our workspace. Over the past 10 years, we've seen cloud services, we've seen remote capabilities, being able to do remote sessions, and that has helped. If the pandemic had happened 10 years ago, I'm telling you, we'll have bigger problems than what we are seeing now. And we do have the capacity. The challenge is we now have to start understanding how can we leverage cloud computing? How can we leverage shared services? And then we have an issue around growing cross-border and supply chain interdependence. You have services that are hosted in a different country. You have things, for example, if you get supplies from China or you're relying on a server that is hosted in South Africa and something happens there, it becomes very critical. So we now have to look at those technology considerations and ask ourselves, are we ready? Are we prepared? Now, how do you start planning for worst case scenarios? Most of us, and I'm told Africans, we're not very good at planning for disasters. And that's why whenever there's a funeral, we all have to come and fundraise. We now need to start looking at it and ask ourselves, what is the exposures we're likely to face? If you're working in Nairobi, there's a likelihood that you'll be faced with a terrorist attack. What are those scenarios? And most of those are not all that complicated. It's a question of now understanding. So when you think about a BCP and your implementation approach, there are a couple of things we focus on. The first one is analyzing your current state. How many employees do you have? Who are your critical services? Or rather, who are your critical customers? What are your critical services? You conduct a risk assessment to allow you to prioritize all those. And then you ask yourself, what is your business? What is the business impact analysis? For example, if you're running a retail store, a supermarket, in a typical current state, you need to be aware that if your payment system is not working and customers cannot check up, then you have a problem. And therefore, it's important that you address any risks around that. Then you have an issue around governance. You have an issue around availability. What services should be available fast? What services should we recover fast? What strategy should we implement? And then you document those procedures, and then you facilitate in terms of the implementation, training, and testing. To expand on that a little bit, it's very critical. And this is just how level timelines that it takes when you're developing a BCP. You need to understand the organization. You need to ask yourself, if we are operating at 100%, if something happened, what is the minimum number of people, services, capabilities we need? You need to conduct a current assessment, identify business threats. And when you think about business threats, you need to be creative. Don't assume that things that have just happened here will not, or rather things that happen in Japan will not happen here. When SARS and MERS happened a couple of years back, we were not worried as much. And therefore, we now need to consider that. Once you have that, you need to look at the business impact analysis of the threats. And then that is a process that takes time, because you need to talk to your board, you need to talk to your different players, you need to talk to your vendors, you need to talk to your host, if it's the ISP that hosts you. The next part is now solution design. For the threats and the impacts analyzed, you need to define the availability and recovery strategies. If you're a bank, for example, it's very critical that your mobile services, your ATMs come back up very fast. If you're a government agency, for example, KRA, you need to make sure that your portal comes back faster if you're using some of these e-citizen portals. So you need to come up with recovery objectives. And if you're able to come up with the recovery objectives, you're very clear. The other part is identifying and designing a suitable command and control notification structure. Who notifies who? Who talks to who? And all these have to be documented. Once you have this in place, then you go back to develop the organization-wide business continuity plan and IT disaster recovery plan, which tie to each other. You cannot develop a disaster recovery plan in absence of a business continuity plan. They have to be tied together so that the head of marketing, the head of operations can be able to coordinate with the CIO if there are critical processes they need to be able to recover. You need to prepare test plans and strategies for the BCP and the ITDR plan, and then you need to carry out simulation exercises. I've spent nights with quite a number of organizations, and most of them actually in technology, or even in some of these service industries, where you decide, let's bring everything down and see how fast we can recover. So that becomes a very critical part, especially knowing very well that the simulation exercise should be reflective of the situation. It will not be perfect, it's tabletop testing, but it should be able to help you address that. The last part is conducting stakeholder awareness training and workshop to sensitize the selected stakeholders on the BCP. If you ask me, the most critical process here is understanding the organization and solution design. You cannot copy and paste a BCP from a different organization and assume it will work. I used to be an auditor, and I've seen many cases where you walk in and you find an organization has copied and pasted a BCP from a different organization. It will not work. Again, thank you very much. I think I'll now give this back to Laura for the Q&A so that we can answer any questions.